All right, today is February the 8th in 2026, and my guest is Eric Verdin, as President and CEO of the Buck Institute. Needs no introduction. As of today, we're concluding the Longevity Biomarkers Summit here during the Infinite Games. We had 2 days where we learned a lot. We had panel discussion. We had Eric talk about the Buck Institute and its mission. Eric, very excited to have you in Prosper for the first time and to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
So, Eric, you had a very long and distinguished career in the science of aging. We might call it zero science. Longevity is now the brand that's thrown around. So, can you walk us a bit through what has been your career up until that date? What have you learned about aging, and where are we at in this present moment in terms of the mission, as you would see it, to make human life better and last longer and healthier and all of that?
So I'm originally from Belgium. Grew up in Liège, went to medical school there. I was a unique medical student in that I wanted to do research and decided that this was a good way to get to research. Did my last year of medical school at Harvard, and it was a life-changing experience in a way that I discovered a whole other world, amazing colleagues, amazing teachers. And I only had one idea after that. It was to come back to the States and do a career in medical research. So I came back, did a postdoc, learning how to really do research, again at Harvard with someone who's famous in the metabolism field. And then after this, I embarked in a career running a lab, starting at the NIH, at a place called the Pickhour Institute, then was recruited to UCSF at the Gladstone Institute, where I was for about 20 years. And about 9 years ago, I had the good fortune of getting the job as CEO and president of the Buck Institute. And so my career has, worked on a lot of different topics. I have focused on, my lab is known for identifying some of the first epigenetic regulators. So they're called HDACs, histone deacetylases, and some of those are the so-called sirtuins. And it turned out that sirtuins were involved in aging. And this is how my lab sort of made a turn from purely being a lab about epigenetic regulation to studying the aging process. And that was about 20 years ago. And so we studied aging in a variety of model systems, especially in mice. And about 2016, as I mentioned, I was recruited to the Buck. And this really gave me a unique opportunity. As an MD, I've always done research with an eye on how can we improve human health? What does this mean for humanity? So not just studying biology for the sake of biology, but with the goal of really translating it to humans. And when I got the job at the Buck, one of the reasons I got that job is I presented to the board this idea that studying aging is fascinating. We had been doing this in mice for a long time, but around 2015, we thought that the field has reached a level of maturity that we can start translating the science into humans. And so I proposed to the board a whole vision of how we could recruit people who were more adept or knew about human biology, build a clinical center. And this is what we've been doing for the last 9 years now. And so it is an amazing time in aging biology. Not only for me as a scientist, I still run a lab with 20 people at the Buck. I'm involved in a number of biotech companies. And one thing that's been the icing on the cake is being the leader of the Buck Institute. It gives me an incredible vision of the whole field and the ability to to speak my mind and to have a voice in terms of where I think the field should be going and where it could be going.
Yeah. So can you maybe walk us through a bit the state of the science and technology we have as you see it? In what ways are we underrating or not yet seeing the progress that we've made? And in what ways are we maybe overrating it?
A very good question, and one that's critical, because the field of aging is big, as you know, and it has, I've always taken the approach that it is everybody belongs. So I'm not in any position to decide who is in the field, who is not in the field. I mean, there are people that I agree strongly with and some people that I disagree strongly with. But I think I try to be respectful of everyone's opinion. And the bottom line is, in any human endeavor, no one has all the answers. As an organization that is a biomedical research institution, I think I try to take a somewhat, what some people have called conservative view of the whole field. Uh, Buck is in this for the long term. I hope that 100 years from now, we will be one of the biggest research institutes in the world. That's our vision, maybe even 20 years from now. But we have to survive, we have to grow, and we have to do this systematically. And one anecdote I want to give you is that when I started in the field about 20 years ago, the discoveries that my lab and others made were so revolutionary, we thought this is going to change medicine. And here we are 25 years later, and we are just starting to change medicine, I think, for the better. Now, what are the areas that are really key? If I had to summarize them, is one, we now know how to change the rate of aging. Certainly in animal models, we can slow it down, and we have early evidence, and in some cases we can revert it. That is amazing. If you had told me this 20 years ago, I would have said there's no way. But we can do this. Now, can we do this in humans? We don't know. But there's no reason, biology does not work in a dramatically different way in humans than it does in mice. So I predict we will have ways of reverting aging in humans in the future. That's number one. Number two is the whole idea of something called the geroscience hypothesis. This is something that was discovered at the Buck. This is the idea that aging, which we know how to control, is the biggest risk factor for all of the chronic disease of aging. And right now, we live twice as long as about 150 years ago, but we live not healthy. And if you're 65, you have 80% chance of carrying one of the chronic disease of aging: heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, macular degeneration, osteoarthritis, type 2 diabetes. The list goes on, 62 different conditions. Aging is the biggest risk factor. And as our parents are getting older, or as I'm getting older, we start seeing around us our friends, our siblings, our parents being sick and really having a disabled life. And so now we have a lever, instead of treating all of these diseases as if they were independent occurrence, we have a lever which is the biggest risk factor. So that's the biggest immediate net results of this research, is that we for the first time, can impact all of these diseases together and therefore increase health span. And that's a whole part of the longevity field, which is focused mostly on health span. How can we not only live longer, but live better? And if you look at the Buck Institute, our tagline is live better longer. And I always tell people in that order. We will live longer in the future, but let's first live better, because people are not, in my conversation with people, they're not interested in living necessarily longer if it doesn't mean a good quality of life. So that's really a big part of our focus. The second aspect of the aging research is really pushing the envelope. How much are we going to be able to increase our lifespan? And we can do amazing things in animal models. We can double the lifespan of a mouse using some genetic modification. We can increase it by 30, 40% with drugs. How much of this is going to be translated to humans? And so that these are really the two big poles in research: longevity, increasing the length. The other one is quality of life, health span. Now, one third big area in this is how do we actually measure this? When we move from mice to human, we have a huge problem. If you do an experiment in mice, you study their lifespan. Same in the worms, C. elegans, or in fruit flies. You can do this in 2 or 3 years. In humans, if we have novel therapies that we want to try, you don't want to wait 30 years, 40 years to find out that your treatment is either toxic or not working or maybe working. So the whole field of biomarkers of aging is really a big area in the field of research. Is can we identify surrogate markers that are predictive of how well you're aging? Can we at age 40 measure your biological age and determine whether your rate of aging is faster or slower? Can we, if we give you a drug, can we over a period of 2 or 3 years determine whether that drug is helping you or actually hurting you? that really is the whole framework of reworking. And one of our efforts at the Buck has been the creation of a clinical research unit, which is a center that really is involved in clinical trials. Right now, we have 7 clinical trials. Some of them are involved with novel molecules that we're giving people, and we're measuring their biological aging and trying to see, can we impact aging in humans?
Yeah. So I'd like to know more about these clinical trials. But before we get there, I wanted to you gave a very compelling anecdote at the conference about the idea of healthspan and why it comes before lifespan, right? So when you ask people in a room who would like to live to 150, and you had an audience at like a TED event, which is not people that are not open to new ideas. These people are very open to new ideas. Only 2 out of 800 people raised their hand. And then you modified in saying 150 years at sort of comparable or the same health that you would like have right now, or that would be.
50, actually. I gave them the example.
Exactly. And then all the hands went up, right?
Of course. I think, healthy living, most of us have a happy life.
Yeah.
I want to live as long as possible. I'm not opposed to living to 500 if I could do it, but not at every cost. And I think quite often what you hear when you deal with really old people whose life quality is diminished, many of them at the end of life actually are asking to go because it's not worth it anymore. This is not, this type of life is not what I want to live. So I think that's why I think as a field, it's really important that we focus on the quality. And, some of the most novel biomarkers of aging that we are studying are so-called intrinsic capacity, which is they're measuring essentially your function. How well do you hear, listen? How can you hear? How much can you see? How mobile are you? So, it doesn't really help you to have a low biological age if you're confined to a wheelchair. And so can you pick up your grandchildren from the floor? So there's a movement in the longevity field right now to focus on really what matters to people.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, it's not just that they're deciding the agenda, they're also supporting it.
Yeah.
They're supporting the NIH, supporting, VC companies and so on. As humans, I believe we all aspire to pretty much the same thing.
Yeah. And I also think these are not necessarily in conflict, right? The lifespan and the health span and what kind of your messaging is to the public. So on this podcast and in general, we had sort of more exposure to the sort of radical life extension narrative. And I agree with that in principle as a North Star, but my criticism has always been you don't need to shout that into people's faces, right? So it's like an A to B to Z, right? So the North Star is the Z, but we need concrete steps to get there. One of these steps is that you give products into the hands of people that they want. And what does it help you to like tell people that they should want something that they currently don't want? Like you have to adjust your messaging and also build products around what people actually want. And my thesis has always been we don't need sort of a more radical public messaging or something like that, even if we agree on these same goals, but we need to show it works. I need to give the product into people's hands and make them want more by seeing the concrete benefits of it.
I completely agree. And I've shared with you that sometimes some people have called me the health span guy. They're doing this not in an admiring way. They're doing this in an annoyed way. And so I've been told that some people are actually annoyed because Eric is the health span guy. He doesn't understand what this field is all about. Well, let me reassure all of your audience, I'm not the health span guy, but I think as a field, we have to start walking before we run. And, this is a brand new field and one in which we're trying to reform medicine and the way we think about health. And so I claim, and we don't have a single victory. So before we talk about living to 150 or 170, for which there is no evidence today, it is our North Star. This is really increasing lifespan, but not at all cost. And so what I worry about when I hear colleagues talking about living to 150 or 190, some others, is the fact that it's a lure. It's a sort of it's like a North Star that people can speak to some people, and I don't dispute this. I don't disagree as a goal. It's a laudable goal, but it also distracts you by some of the amazing things that we can do today. It's been calculated that if we were to increase lifespan by 1 year Okay, we're not talking about 70 years. By 1 year, $37 trillion is the economic output. And this was done by Andrew Scott from reputed economist. So I have no reason to doubt that number. And I tell people, today, based on what we know, most people could expect to live to 95 in good health. I can bring you there today. And so my focus for the number of years that I have left in my career, I'm going to make sure that we get there. At the same time, at the Buck, we have scientists that are studying, novel mechanisms that are going to bring us to the next step. Let's first all get to 100, then we will talk about getting to 120, and then 140, and then 160. So I think the future is bright. I do believe that as we've doubled our life expectancy over the last 150 years. That's already awesome. And so I want to devote the rest of my life to trying to push this agenda and really lead us to where those numbers are going to become reality one day.
I also think there is sort of also a rational reason for these different narratives. Like, if we, on the one hand, especially with the Buck Institute, you have sort of very large visibility for the bigger and public mission, right? So you can't necessarily take the largest risk in ways that the public might not necessarily find laudable or acceptable or whatever. And sort of let's work on the things that we now have a good reason to believe could actually work, and we have the scientific evidence. But I think it's also fine for someone to say, hey, I'm taking this approach. It might only have a 1 or 2% of succeeding.
Yes.
But then it gives us additional 10 years or 20 years.
Yes. And we work, by the way, we are working on all of this.
And then you also need sort of a more radical and challenger message, right? Because you need to win people over for a very difficult, almost impossible mission, right? So they better believe that there's a lot that can come out of it. And then they're like the rebel alliance. So and to me, that's a bit of a natural order of things in a way.
And for me, one does not exclude the other. And
Exactly.
I think the Buck is about both. I mean, we have a radical agenda. We want to increase longevity in humans as much as we can. And I think, we have scientists that are pushing the envelope as far as you can possibly, making the novel discovery. So it's not, for me, it's never been you're either a health span guy or a lifespan guy. We are all both. And frankly, the worst would be increased lifespan without any health span and increasing the misery for an extra 20 years. Nobody wants this. So I think the answer for me, when I think about health span and lifespan, there are two sides of the same coin. You cannot dissociate one from the other.
And also to the credit of at least the part of the movement that I've been exposed to, there's a very strong emphasis on the science on either side.
It's all it is for us.
A kind of skepticism about what you call the Instagram longevity.
Yes.
So,
yeah, there's a whole parallel world, which is
these are not the people we're talking to typically, right? But this is what most of the public knows or thinks that's the field is.
And that's been actually one of the first frustrating aspects for me is the fact that as a field and as scientists, we are typically understated and we are typically, I would say, humble and modest, and we are educated not to make claims that are not true until we are sure about them, or at least as sure as we can be. So in some way, as scientists, we have ceded the public sphere to a number of influencers who are essentially taking our work and describing it. So one of the things I can tell you I've decided to do this past year is to really become much more visible and public in terms of defending what we're doing, explaining the importance of the work that the Buck is doing. So I just started an Instagram account. I have very few followers, so please go check me out. LinkedIn, we're posting something at a slightly higher level. And then we just started a Substack, which is also going to be even at a further higher level where we're going to be reviewing the science of aging, key papers, key discoveries, and so on. So you can find all of those. Eric Verdin, MD on Instagram, Eric Verdin on LinkedIn, and Verdin Lab on the Substack.
Amazing. So let's talk a bit about the current focus of the Buck Institute and especially the clinical trials that you're doing, right? Because I'm pretty sure a lot of thought went into selecting these are going to be the targets of the what we going to do the clinical trials on, therapies and the drugs, the indications it's going for, and what it could ultimately do to the field. So I'm very curious to hear about that.
So to give you an idea what is happening, so we have, I'll describe a few of these clinical trials. Some of them are involving products that we have invented at the Buck Institute. One of them I invented is a ketone body ester. Are you familiar with ketosis, which is a process that you enter a state of ketosis when you're fasting, or when you're restricting carbohydrates. My lab has worked on the biology of ketosis for a number of years. And the problem of ketogenic diet or fasting is that it's not always easy to maintain in the long term. And we know the ketone bodies are protective against aging. We have some strong evidence for this. So for example, we published a paper showing that if you put mice on a ketogenic diet, they tend to live healthier and longer. And so one of the things we've done is to create this ketone body ester, a product that we call ketone, Quitone, that is a supplement. But my insistence was, if we're going to sell a supplement, we have to actually test it in clinical trials. So we have a number of clinical trials where we are first testing its effect in normal people, trying to measure what happens to biomarkers of aging. Another clinical trial is actually testing the effect of this ketone body in frail individuals, trying to see, can we actually make them live long? It's not really a life expectancy type of study, but we're measuring all of the markers of frailty. We have another study testing another product from a colleague at the Buck, Pankaj Kapahi, as a product called Glylo, which is helping in mitigating the effect of high blood sugar. And so that's underway as well. Then we have a series of clinical trials where we are testing a whole series of novel biomarkers. And I can speak a little bit about this.
Please. So, and also about what's going on in the field of biomarkers and the PROSPER study potentially. So
yes. So one of the idea, as I mentioned earlier, these biomarkers are tools that we hope to develop to do two things. One is assess your state of health at any age. Number one.
So you have a personal health dashboard.
Exactly.
But ideally before it goes down because you have a disease, right?
Exactly.
It has some predictive validity.
Yeah. And so so by the way, it's fascinating for me to come to Infinita and to see the Infinita game, which is essentially taking a whole bunch of volunteers, bringing them, having them do some interventions and repeatedly measuring them. So we're completely aligned in terms of what we're trying to do. One thing to know is that the way medicine is practiced today is relying on so few markers. So if you have your annual blood draw from your doctor, maybe he will draw for 50 different markers: your blood sugar, your blood glucose, the number, your hematocrit, the number of blood cells, your hemoglobin A1C. So very, very, very simple, your blood pressure and so on. Out of the best biological tools that we have today, we can generate millions of data points. Okay, so if I draw your blood, I can measure about 20,000 proteins in your blood. I can measure 20,000 transcripts, about 5,000 proteins, maybe 10,000 metabolites. So we have a plethora of data. These are all research tools. I can also integrate this with your medical records. I can integrate this with all of your wearables. I can integrate this with some cognitive tests, your grip strength, your ability, how fast you're walking, your gait speed, your VO2 max. So right now, our vision is that we don't know which of these markers is going to be the most important. Epigenetic clocks, where we're measuring DNA methylation. So some of our clinical trials, which were funded by ARPA-H, a new program from the US government, is essentially taking everything that we can measure and repeatedly measure it over time during the circadian rhythm, during a 24-hour period, and to measure it under basal condition, fasting, feeding, but also after really unique perturbation. For example, if we do a VO2 max, we're going to exercise you to your limit. What happens to all of these markers? What happens if we do a glucose tolerance test when we make you drink 70 grams of glucose? So we're really trying to assess of these millions of markers, how do they vary? Which ones are stable? And ultimately, which ones are predictive of disease and which ones respond to therapy? So this is really a large project that we're collaborating with ARPA-H and an organization led by Lee Hood called Phenome Health. And I think the Buck and Phenome Health, I think, are going to redefine the whole space of the so-called biomarkers of aging. And so I'm really excited by what we're doing with respect to this.
Yeah. And biomarkers are kind of also a foundational tool that's really necessary to do any meaningful clinical trials on longevity or aging related treatments, right? Because it's almost impossible or too long or too expensive to do trials that actually look at mortality of individuals.
Not going to
right? So,
happen, yes.
yeah, so you need kind of and that was like a big challenge for the field, right? Because without that, there's not much you can prove, right?
Agree. And not to say also anything about the fact that we know that many interventions, even though you might start them on a good intention to help people, you might actually hurt them.
Yeah.
And so the sooner you can identify these signals that signal trouble, the better off you'll be. So it's not only to determine efficacy and to do it faster, but it's also to really root out all the potential problems.
So can you talk a bit about what you see as sort of the institutional challenges of bringing the science forward, right? So there's been also conversations during this conference about the FDA, the NIH. They've been exposed to various criticisms, and some of these criticism might be valid or not valid. But what have you kind of seen firsthand? What do you think you see as a challenge with how the current ways in which we do science?
So first, one of the biggest challenges in the longevity field is resources. It's not talked about enough, but our resources from investors, from the government, from all sides are tiny in comparison to what they should be. If you think about the amount of money that we're spending trying to cure cancer versus trying to cure heart disease, if we were to cure cancer today, people have estimated a so-called moonshot where enormous amounts of resources are being sent by these moonshots. If we were to cure cancer today, life expectancy would increase by 2.5 years. Same thing if you cured heart disease. So minimum effect versus if you cured aging or if you slowed it down, as I mentioned, you would affect all diseases. People would live much longer. So there's this incredible situation where we live in a world which is driven by disease understanding. So people are practicing what I call whack-a-mole medicine, where we are sort of whacking one disease after the other, not realizing that these are only the branches of a tree, and that when we hit the trunk, that's longevity, and that's the aging mechanism, we're going to have much bigger impact. So that's the biggest problem that we have right now. Even though this model system, the geroscience hypothesis, have been well established, proven in multiple model systems, society hasn't moved and gotten to help us. So there's a need for more investment from the government, from philanthropists, from donors, and from pharma companies, and so on. It is changing, and I believe we are starting to see the acceleration of all of this. You probably have seen in the past year, there's much more interest in the longevity space, much more investment. So I believe it's going to change, but we need many more people to come to our help to accelerate the discovery. One of the reasons is that we don't really have a victory yet. It's easy to say we're going to change the world.
Number of successful drugs or treatments for aging.
Exactly. So,
Zero.
and pharma, I mean, for all of its trouble, has actually gotten us in large part to where we are today. So no wonder people are investing with them. There are proven value in which, you can do this. That being said, there are a whole series of problems with pharma. The rate at which they generate new discoveries is slowing down. The cost of developing new drugs is increasing. We see China has actually developed a much faster model. For the first time this past year, Chinese companies have actually gotten cleared the same number of drugs as in the US. And that signals the fact that they're doing things faster and smarter than we are. So there's a need to reform the way we think about drug development. These trials have become incredibly expensive. And I think, one of the things that I like about the longevity space is, and one reason for me to be here is that we are not accepting things the way they are. We want to challenge the system. And, Prospera, Finita, the games, all of these are, for me, a ferment of bubbling activity and challenge to the system. And I think I embrace this, and I think we want to be part of all of these efforts because eventually they will lead to a better and more efficient system. And the ultimate goal is to just make people healthier and live longer.
I think there's a bit of that's a bit of part of the reason also why I felt nicely adopted in the longevity community, right? So that's not my background, right? I came to Prospera 4 years ago, and I wasn't longevity pilled yet until about like 1 year in, when I got exposure to the longevity community, Zuzalu, for example, and where Vitalik Buterin started a pop-up city that invited several of these frontier tech fields. And that was kind of what brings me to this observation. There's a bit of this familiarity between different fields, such as longevity and crypto, and also sort of the governance, innovation, some call it network state, charter cities, whatever space, because we're all challengers. We're all in kind of a way outside the system, and therefore we kind of recognize each other, even though we're in a different field.
We are iconoclasts.
Yeah.
And frankly, if you think about the longevity space with respect to the traditional biomedical research establishment, I really love the idea that we are iconoclasts. And I've argued, I used to say that we should reform medicine. I'm convinced that we cannot reform medicine because it is an economic system that has too many vested interests. And if you are, at least for some physicians, hospitals, an insurance company, a pharma company, it all works. And you're in the system. And we have a group like us coming and saying we need to change the whole system. We can suppress all of these diseases. You could be wondering what's going to happen to all of my drugs as a pharma company. So the idea that we will reform the system by working with it, to me, is no longer working. I think we have to change. We have to bring novel drugs that are essentially going to decrease this burden of chronic disease. And we might be seeing hints of this right now with the GLP-1 agonist. And the only thing I need to tell people is to look at the size of that market. Instead of having drugs that target one thing like statins, good example, target heart disease as an entity, $20 billion market. I predict that the GLP-1 agonists, which for all we can see right now, are showing, I hate to say the word anti-aging, but sort of more pro-longevity factors across the different populations, are going to be 10 times probably larger as a market. And my prediction is that the aging space has the potential to generate multiple molecules on that scale. And that's definitely our long-term vision, is we're going to be creating medicine that are going to have more powerful effect on human health than any other molecules that have been created so far.
Mm-hmm. What do you think at the present moment, funding is one challenge, but do you think you need more researchers and scientists or more entrepreneurs and company builders?
We need both. And that's really an important point because so resources in some way, to go back, as I mentioned, is the great limiting factor, is the driver of more people. There are so few people studying the mechanism of aging in comparison to people studying diseases by themselves. Our whole model system is based on the idea that we have a National Institute of Health, but it's not a National Institute of Health. It's a National Institute of Disease. You have a National Institute for Aging. That's a good one. It doesn't receive enough money, in my opinion. We have another one which is focused on heart disease, one focused on neurological disorders. And they dwarf the amount of money that is spent on the basic mechanism of aging. Now, if you want to create a really efficient ecosystem, you need both. You need the discovery engine, and then you need a translation engine. If you think about drug companies and clinical trials, this is the discovery engine. it cannot exist in the absence of a discovery engine. And so some people, there's a big movement right now in terms of let's create more companies, let's do all of this. You cannot create companies if you don't have the basic discoveries to yield them. So I think, to me, and this is what we're trying to do at the Buck, we have what I call from bench to bedside. So we have people being treated, and we're studying aging in yeast and in C. elegans, who live 21 days. So, and we know that many of the lessons that we learned in these simple model system can transfer all the way to human. So the integration of the two together is really where the powerful integration lies.
And what have you learned so far, or what insights do you think you're pondering about or thinking about from your trip here to Prospera?
So I think, you are sitting at a really radical way of doing things. We've taken a more conservative way, which is to work with the system. But I also recognize that the system is not serving us and serving, frankly, anybody in the best way that it could. So I came here, as I told you, with a humble approach, trying to see, okay, what can I learn there, or how things could be different. I've loved our interactions, and I hope we're going to continue to interact, because I have a lot to learn from you, and I think this is mutual. So in some way, by being together in this ecosystem, this is how we're going to change the world.
Yeah, I very much appreciate getting to know you, learning so much from you. Like, as I always like to tell people is, of course we're starting outside the system, but the goal is not to stay there, right? The goal is to establish a new system, right? Or establish something that the existing system can adopt, right? So sort of exiting or going to a different place is not the end goal, right? The end goal is to learn something that then others can adopt, right? So,
and my wife was here attending the meeting, and after the first day, we were chatting. Okay, what are your impressions? And we were both. One of the things that I think, I don't remember if she said it or I said it, but if you think about it, many of us go through life in a system that we accept, and we just live and we conform. We obey the law. We do what we're supposed to do. So many of us, there's some form of conformism, which actually works for you. You can lead a pretty good life. But then we were thinking, okay, what happened when the Greek established democracy? Can you imagine the changes that this represented at the time? The same for the Romans. So these were periods of, and it actually worked incredibly well for them, because they challenged the system, which was the old purely autocratic system. The same thing with the American Revolution. Look at how far the U.S. has gone. So I think when a society takes its existing system and challenges it, I'm not necessarily calling for a revolution, but a challenge to the system, there's always the potential to create something better. And so what's happening here, to me, represents a challenge to the system. And we've already seen some of the results. As we discussed, Montana passed a right to try law. We're seeing the same thing across some other states. So I really view you guys as sort of bucking the system and trying to challenge it. And we'll make mistakes along the way, but I think we will not die not trying.
Yeah, that's what I ultimately also think the American experiment was so successful. Because, as you said, this was an experiment back then. It was a revolution. Sort of the idea that you can have this limited government and democracy and things like that. And ultimately, I think America is still the place that has most harboring the entrepreneurial spirit, or the spirit of, and the entrepreneurial spirit of, what's important or integral to it is let the outsiders or innovators do their thing. Like, don't shut it down. That's kind of the foundational idea or culture of Silicon Valley, right? So have people try out things, even though it looks weird, let them do things. And I think that's this kind of foundational spirit of America. And I think to some degree that is still there, especially in the discovery of research and science that we're doing in development. But I think it gets in many ways hindered by too large or centralized institutions. And I think it gets blocked out too much by the existing clinical development process. But ultimately, it's kind of only the American idea of let's try something different, which includes this here, that can then lead to a system change for everything. So
I completely agree. And both of us grew up in Europe, and
there, I don't, I don't see it.
and I'm one. If you look at one of the things that brought me to America, and it's not to condemn Europe. Europe is an older civilization which has become somewhat more encrusted into its old habits. One of the things I've always been fascinated by what's happening in America is first, this tension between the states, individual states, and the federal government. There's always a lot of challenges between the two. It's built into the system so that they actually are really always pushing the envelope and pushing against each other. That's one. The second aspect is this idea of the country being a laboratory of ideas and experiments, and the way laws are introduced and the way these propositions are introduced. They challenge the system constantly. And I think I'm always amazed, for how much debate there is. And we're seeing right now an extreme of this form of the debate, pushing in one direction versus the other. But I think this is quite often misunderstood in a way that this is a system that is in constant movement. And I think out of it comes some really significant strength.
Yeah. So let's close by talking again a bit more about the bug and your future plans, right? So you it's a nonprofit, right? So you're constantly fundraising for it. Some of the listeners might wonder how it would compare to spend money at the bug and what it's doing versus other institutions or private markets, right? So what is kind of distinguishing you from others in that sense? I mean, you're the most esteemed institution in the space for sure, but what is this iteration doing that others aren't yet?
Yeah. So I would love for people to think about the BUC as a sort of revolutionary organization in this movement, in a way that we were the first institute focused on the biology of aging. We've been in business now for 25 years. We operate as a not-for-profit, and I'll qualify this in 1 second. We have 300 employees, all studying aging. We're organized in 21 different groups, each of them with a faculty member who conduct their own independent research. So it's not like a pharma company where I direct everything. All of these scientists and employees are encouraged to actually come up with radical ideas. We are multidisciplinary. The fastest growing area right now at the BUC is 35% of our work is close to AI. So, riding that wave of AI being a really future driver of discovery. We are rapidly building a clinical facility that will allow us to not only make the discovery, start companies, and translate them into clinical trials right at the BUC. So I think, we have the potential to double the size of the Institute in the next 10 to 20 years, and I intend to actually make that happen. That would be about 600 people, and really everything we do, but on steroids. Our multidisciplinarity, we have engineers, we have mathematicians, we have bioinformaticians, people in AI, we have pure biologists, we have clinicians. So we have an incredible ferment of interest in aging, which I think create an environment which is unequaled in the world. My vision is really to accelerate this. We are at the time where the only rate limiting step is the resources. Now, the other thing that people should know about it is that we are extremely agile. I have 2 mandates from my board, which is that our work be ethical and be focused on aging. Short of this, we can enter partnership with organizations, with companies. So we do a lot of work with biotech companies. We launch a startup about once or twice a year. So we have a whole series of startups. Some of them have raised hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's not that we're starting at this. And we are taking a really active part into the building these companies. So many of them actually we incubate on site at the BUC where they can benefit from the rest of the environment. So I tell people, if you want to partner with us and you have a unique idea, just approach us, because we are, I would, eminently open-minded to changing, the ways that biomedical research is done. And, one big area is so-called FRAs, the OFROs, these research organizations that are focused on one unique topic. So I think it's a unique time for people to get involved in aging research. And if you want to, discuss something, I invite all of your audience, write to me, ericverdin@me.com. It's not easy. We can maybe post it on the podcast at the end. And just tell me where you heard me, and let's start a discussion.
Fantastic. Eric, it was an honor to have you here in Prospera, and thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me, and I hope to see you soon.